Hello everyone, in this video I want to talk about how to clear histamine from the body. So I guess the first thing to appreciate is there are three considerations when it comes to what is contributing to the amount of histamine that we have to clear. And what I mean by that is we are eating histamine from histamine containing foods. We may have an overgrowth of bacteria that produce histamine in our gut. And histamine is released from certain immune cells, in particular mast cells and basophils. These are just two types of immune cells that we know contain histamine within them and have the ability to release, or as the cell breaks down, release that histamine that's contained within it. So those are the three sort of routes that we have to be thinking about when we are trying to answer the question, how do we clear histamine from the body? Now we're going to focus, at least at the beginning of this video, on true histamine intolerance, which is going to be a sort of dietary and gut related histamine clearance mechanism. But I will touch on a little bit mast cell activation syndrome and mast cell disorders afterwards to kind of touch on this third source of histamine, so to speak. So when we think of histamine intolerance, this is technically when we are lacking enough DAO enzyme to break down dietary histamine. So histamine is found in a huge list of foods, ranging from dairy products, cheese and milk, to fermented products, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, through to things like tomatoes, fish, and especially sort of aged animal produce. So meat or poultry that has been in the fridge for a few days, or just leftover dinner or lunch, salami and similar sort of deli products. And then you've got certain berries like strawberries, and the list goes on. I'll give a link to a food list below. The main thing to appreciate is there is the low histamine diet, which in true histamine intolerance has to be considered. The analogy often given that you may well have heard is the histamine bucket. If you think that we all have a bucket where our histamine is poured into, whether that's from a dietary perspective, a microbial perspective, or to some degree from a mast cell perspective, the symptoms of histamine issues are going to come on when the bucket is full. So we want to try and reduce what's going into the bucket and empty the bucket. And one of the ways we can do that is by reducing our intake of histamine from food, hence the low histamine diet. Now that in its own right is going to help then the body clear histamine because there's just less load in the system. There's less being poured into the bucket. And as a result, the bucket is going to start to empty, so to speak, as well. But when you have histamine intolerance, almost by definition really, you are lacking DAO enzymes. These are enzymes found within the gut lining that help break down histamine from food. It's not therefore uncommon for people who have had some damage to the lining, especially of their small intestine, to develop histamine intolerance. And this is why a lot of people with IBS, with SIBO, have histamine issues as part of their overall symptom profile, or they're just health issues. So if you notice that you get an exacerbation of certain symptoms after eating some of those foods that I just mentioned, then that's one of the first things that might get you leading to question histamine intolerance. So that sort of leads in maybe to the question, what are histamine symptoms? And it is a long list. There are a couple of visuals that I've seen in the research that basically show us that really every bodily system can be impacted by histamine intolerance. So from a digestive system perspective, you might have abdominal pain, cramps, diarrhea, and to some degree maybe some bloating. In my experience with histamine intolerance, it's less likely to be constipation, but that can happen as well. I certainly have experienced histamine intolerance with sort of constipation / IBSM, where you fluctuate between diarrhea and constipation. But then you can have respiratory symptoms, just something like asthma, but it could just be some difficulty with breathing that doesn't have a diagnosis. We get cardiovascular symptoms, so heart rate, palpitations, tachycardia, sort of arrhythmias. These are all sorts of things that can be related to histamine issues. It can be more cognitive and, cognitive. So things like poor word recall, brain fog is a really big one, but also skin, so urticaria, sort of just general redness, itching, rashes. It can be more nasal, so sinus congestion, a runny nose. What else could we put in there? I think those are probably the big ones. Oh, and it can also impact the monthly cycle in females as well. So as I say, pretty much every bodily system can be impacted in some shape or form. And as a result, you just get this long list of weird and wonderful symptoms that sometimes can make it hard to diagnose a histamine issue. And in fact, people with mast cell activation syndrome, which is whereby there aren't an increase in the number of these immune cells, mast cells in the body, but they are overactive. They're responding at a lower threshold than someone without the condition. It can take a decade for people to get an accurate diagnosis sometimes. So those are the signs and the symptoms. We've talked about sort of the dietary origin of histamine that we need to be mindful about if we're trying to clear histamine from the body. And we mentioned that DAO is kind of the critical enzyme here that has a role to play. Now, DAO requires certain nutrients for its production and function, and that includes copper and vitamin C. So deficiencies in any of those sorts of nutrients could also jeopardize DAO production, DAO status, and therefore your capacity to digest histamine. Now, for those where it is a DAO deficit that's driving those histamine symptoms, the supplementation of DAO enzymes is a total game changer. Now, it isn't for everyone. And I would argue the main reason is there are other reasons why you can have a histamine buildup and issues with histamine generally. But if there is a DAO deficit, you will notice improvement in symptoms by supplementing it. So a very sort of easy at-home test you can do is get a bottle of DAO enzymes. Admittedly, they're not the cheapest because there aren't actually that many brands that manufacture it, and therefore I imagine just from an economic perspective and a competitive perspective they can keep their prices higher, so there's a business opportunity there for someone. But doing that for, let's say, a week or two, normally within a few days you're going to know whether there is an improvement to symptoms. If you don't notice improvement to symptoms, finish the bottle maybe, but obviously just don't reorder, and you can have some confidence with the idea that, okay, this isn't a DAO issue, I don't need to continue kind of going down that rabbit hole, I can look elsewhere. But there's going to be a fairly good percentage of you, I imagine, who are going to have a really positive response to incorporating DAO into your plan. I will put a link below to my favorite DAO enzymes if you want a recommended brand and product. We then have the microbiome piece, and as mentioned, if you have SIBO or LIBO, large intestine bacterial overgrowth, then you may have an overgrowth of bacteria that are known histamine producers. And in this scenario, you still are going to get some relief from going onto a lower histamine diet, but please note that no matter what your sort of primary cause of histamine issues is or are, the low histamine diet is purely about symptom relief, and therefore it is not a long-term strategy, and you really do have to weigh up the pros and cons of just doing it. And that's going to partly come back to the severity of the symptoms you're experiencing, but also how you are relating and responding to your symptoms. So just to give you a little anecdotal kind of story here, you know, I've had histamine issues, relatively severe, but nowhere near as severe as some people have them. And as an example, I would have eggs. And I also suspect I have a low level allergy to eggs. But I love eggs. They're really convenient. They're a relatively good source of protein at breakfast time, but certainly they're convenient and they're very nutrient dense. And I would have, let's say, 4 eggs for breakfast, and on one morning I actually wouldn't be able to finish it because I felt some nausea and I just felt really yucky from eating eggs. But then either the day after or maybe a few days later, I could eat 4 eggs and I wouldn't have any symptoms, and it felt like that went down really well. So immediately sort of I was aware that it's not the food per se, because on one day I can tolerate it and another day I can't. So either it's an accumulation of all the foods over a period of time, let's say a day or two, or there's just something else going on in my physiology that means that when that thing's going on or is spiking or peaking, I can't tolerate that amount of egg, whether that's because I'm having a very low level allergy sort of response to it, or I'm having a histamine sort of response to it. Now, eggs aren't the best example from a histamine perspective because it's debated in regards to whether they're actually high or low histamine anyway. However, the point still stands, which is listen to your body. I always prioritize the convenience and some of my other goals in health, like I love going to the gym, I do a lot of strength training, I try and really make sure that I get my calories, I'm a bit of a foodie, I like my food. Unless I really have to remove a food, I'm just not going to, essentially. That's my mentality and always has been. And as a result, I kind of just put up with some symptoms. Now, as I say, the severity of the symptoms is going to influence very much if you can put up with it or not. But fortunately for me, mine were low, sometimes moderate, never, let's say, severe, where I was having to take time off work, obviously, or anything like this. But it's a really important conversation to have with your practitioner if you have one, or something to sit with, which is, what's my priority here? Like, so many people get anxious, stressed, depressed because they're on a restricted diet. And most of the time it's only symptom management anyway. So could you keep a little bit more diversity and breadth to your diet and enjoy your food if you can tolerate, so to speak, any symptom flare-ups, while working on the underlying imbalances which are driving it in the first place? Now, having said that, a lot of the time it will be helpful to take one step back to take two steps forward, meaning you might want to go onto a restrictive diet for, let's say, somewhere in the region of 4 to 8 weeks as a way to empty the bucket, or at least reduce what's in the bucket, improve quality of life by improving symptom levels while you go about addressing the underlying issue. So it's very personal here, I think. But if we go back to how this all started, thinking about SIBO and LIBO, then yes, something like a low FODMAP diet or a low histamine diet, one of those two could be really helpful from a symptom management perspective. And in fact, research has shown that a low FODMAP diet can significantly reduce total levels of histamine flowing around the body. And that's partly because a lot of people with histamine issues generally have gut issues and microbial imbalances or overgrowths as well. So you could consider doing low FODMAP, you could do low histamine, you could try both. And there are diets out there that combine both, but that is very restrictive and should be reserved for, I'm going to just call it extreme cases ultimately. But those dietary changes are really important. So one of the ways to clear histamine from the body is going to be supporting the breakdown of histamine with DAO and modifying the diet to reduce the amount that's going into your bucket or body ultimately. And then you've got a greater, easier chance of clearing what remains ultimately. Now you're going to do that by modifying the microbiome. The diet will help, but you can consider your usual interventions that we've talked about a lot on this channel: probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics, antimicrobials where appropriate and needed as well, and things like polyphenols, omega-3 fatty acids, which both support the microbiome and actually have prebiotic type properties to them as well. So one of my favorites probiotics when someone is dealing with histamine issues is Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, one of the world's most researched probiotics to this day, and I've used it for 2 decades in clinic, and I've used it a lot on myself over the years with really great success. So again, there'll be links below to all of these products I mentioned if you want to check them out. There are absolutely others. Some of you will know, for example, Seeking Health have a probiotic that is called Probiota X, I think it is, if it's still called that. And that contains a few species of bacteria that are known not to produce histamine. It's actually potentially one of the reasons why people with gut issues sometimes have a negative response to probiotics if they are taking a probiotic that's actually a known histamine producer. So you need to be careful about your probiotic strain selection when you do have histamine intolerance or mast cell issues going on. And on that note, as a side note, we know again in the research that people who are diagnosed with IBS have an influx of mast cells into the gut lining. So there are more of these immune cells that let's store and release histamine. So that's something that's really worth being mindful about. There's a big chunk of people with irritable bowel syndrome who actually will have significant improvement by going more down a sort of low histamine, antihistamine approach. Prebiotics are really going to depend on the makeup of your microbiome. It could be PHGG that we talk about a lot on this channel, but galacto-oligosaccharides could be something to consider for the bifidobacteria, for example. So there's not a specific prebiotic for histamine issues. With postbiotics, the main one that we have access to at the moment is butyrate. And certainly if you have systemic histamine symptoms, and to some degree even gut-related histamine symptoms, some really do respond well to butyrate, especially the next generation form of butyrate called tributyrin, compared to the butyrate that's been around for quite some time, like sodium butyrate. So I often recommend tributyrin, but you could again try both on different occasions and see if there's one that you respond better to. If not, then always go to the sodium butyrate just because it is a cheaper option than the newer generation tributyrin butyrate. So your normal gut stuff is going to be at play here. You might also need to think about the integrity of that gut lining. Whenever there's been damage to the gut lining, DAO can get compromised, to the level that research has actually discussed whether we can use DAO testing as an indicator of intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut. So if you have DAO issues, you likely have some degree of kind of gut barrier issues as well. And then again, your usual zinc carnosine, L-glutamine, and any of those kind of leaky gut supplements, as it were, are very warranted and could be really helpful, again, in the short term, because the question is, well, why do you have leaky gut, or what's compromised the barrier? Is it historical or is it current? It could be related to the microbiome and imbalances there. It could be related to chronic stress and dysregulation within the nervous system. But histamine can impact the integrity of the gut lining itself. So sometimes healing leaky gut means reducing histamine loads within the gut as well. So you can see how all of these things are interconnected ultimately. So you've got kind of, I'm just going to put sort of gut work that is absolutely part of clearing histamine from the body. That kind of covers the histamine intolerance side of things. You really are thinking a lot about DAO enzymes. You're really thinking about the microbiome, the integrity of the gut lining, your dietary intake of histamine that might need to be modified in the short term. You're absolutely thinking about stress, which increases the amount of histamine that has to be cleared. So stress management is a foundational piece to this as well. If we now start just moving a little bit more into mast cell activation syndrome, this is where you'll hear about supplements like quercetin and vitamin C at high doses that can help stabilize the mast cell. The analogy that I give here is your mast cell is like a balloon, histamine is like water in the balloon, and you can have triggers which can lead to the degranulation of mast cells, which is like a needle popping the balloon, the water going everywhere, and that's the histamine being released into your bloodstream. You get this surge in histamine, which causes brain fog, itchiness, redness, swelling. The example I give is the scene in Hitch, if you've seen that film with Will Smith, whereby he's on a date, he's in sort of a seafood sort of restaurant, and then the next scene he's in the pharmacy, and his ear, his eyelid, his lip have all totally swollen out. He's having a big allergic reaction, looking for the antihistamine. So those are textbook symptoms of an allergy response, a histamine response, an acute histamine response. Quercetin and vitamin C are natural sort of antihistamine / mast cell stabilizers as well. There are others. The one that actually gets the most press in the scientific literature is luteolin. Again, links below the video to these products. Luteolin has a great ability to dampen sort of mast cell degranulation and therefore reduce the amount of histamine that needs to be cleared. Because think about it, when it's in the mast cell, not a problem. When the mast cell degranulates, breaks down, and the histamine flows into the blood, now you need to clear out that histamine. So quercetin, vitamin C, luteolin, I think also black cumin seed oil can be helpful here. Those can help from a mast cell perspective. You obviously have prescribed mast cell stabilizers as well if you have access to a conventional medical professional who's able to actually prescribe that. That's a challenge in itself. Hence the natural route is often taken. But what's the needle? What's the needle that popped the balloon that led to the surge in histamine in the first place? Well, what we see in the research is that that can be related to stress. We just cannot get away from the strong connection between stress and histamine and mast cells. But it can also be environmental toxins. Certain heavy metals like mercury have been discussed in the literature to trigger mast cell sort of activation and breakdown. We have environmental toxins like mycotoxins from mold. So if you lived or have lived in a water damaged building where there is a mold issue, then you likely have been exposed to mycotoxins that can impact mast cells and histamine burden or histamine load as well. We also have kind of these little question marks in the research. And what I mean by that is there's just not that much research there, but we have some clues or breadcrumbs that there is a thyroid connection. Mast cells actually have receptors for thyroid hormones. So there's some kind of connection there for sure. And maybe this explains why if you have a big trigger of mast cells that degranulate, could that also then impact thyroid status in that period as well? And then do some of your symptoms connect with actual thyroid dysfunction as a result of this surge in histamine from mast cell degranulation? So when we think about mast cell activation syndrome, yes, low histamine diet is going to really help symptom management. You may still benefit from DAO enzymes. You're absolutely going to benefit from quercetin, luteolin, vitamin C, bromelain, and these kind of either antihistamines or natural mast cell stabilizers. You may benefit from the right probiotics to support gut health, and you might support from gut lining support. So all of that stuff is still very relevant for MCAS, but that is all still really symptom management, because if you can't figure out or understand what your unique triggers are, then you're always going to be fighting histamine pouring into the system that then needs to be cleared. So you need to think about heavy metals. You might need to think about mycotoxins and the potential for having lived in a property that had a damp, mold, water leak type issue going on. Now, bear in mind that about over 50%, 54% is the statistic of mold in a home is invisible. It's under floorboards, it's in the attic, it's in the wall cavity, it's behind the washing machine or fridge or book cabinets. That's a very common one. Places that you just haven't seen for over a decade potentially. So don't rule it out just because you've never seen mold. The majority of times you won't have, and you are still being exposed to these metabolites called mycotoxins. So in that situation, then that takes you down the rabbit hole of heavy metal detoxification, mycotoxin detoxification, stress management and nervous system support, which is a really big one, I think, when we're talking about kind of mast cell histamine stuff. Now, other clues that you might have a bit of a mast cell issue is if symptoms flare after exercise, or if symptoms flare with environmental change, meaning you go from a warm to a cold or cold to warm environment suddenly, like you've gone from an aircon office into a boiling car park, and then you get a wave of symptoms kick on almost instantly or very, very quickly. That would be a real clue that there could be some mast cell involvement. Or a hot shower leaves you looking really red in your skin. Those are all signs that there could be mast cell involvement there as well. I think that covers everything. We've talked about diet and essentially a low FODMAP, low histamine diet for symptom management. We've talked about DAO enzymes for a subset of people with histamine intolerance being really a prerequisite and foundational supplementation. We then had kind of gut supports, gut lining support with glutamine, zinc, carnosine, probiotics that are known to not produce histamine. Prebiotics, but really based on microbiome testing that you have done. You could do SIBO testing with Healthpath. We offer that, as many of you probably will know. And you could consider microbiome testing with Healthpath, where we do look specifically at, amongst many other things, histamine-producing bacteria. So you can rule in or rule out SIBO and LIBO as a cause of the histamine issues. We also look at fecal zonulin for leaky gut, which, as we've discussed, is strongly connected with this as well. So gut health, gut healing is a big part of this. We then spoke about, obviously, the microbiome and how bacteria can produce histamine, like Klebsiella. Some of these proteobacteria, gram-negative bacteria, are known histamine producers. And then we spoke briefly about mast cells and basophils, but mast cells are the primary one that store release histamine into the system that will then need to be cleared. So we spoke about how stabilizing the mast cell and using natural antihistamines can be helpful as part, again, of kind of symptom management while you investigate the root triggers, whether that's mold, heavy metals, stress, infections I didn't mention, so things like Lyme disease or just some kind of chronic bacterial, viral, parasitic, fungal infection will absolutely contribute to mast cell activation syndrome as well. So there has to be some testing if we're more going down the MCAS route to understand what is your root trigger or triggers, because that has to be in some ways at the forefront of the plan to have any chance of effectively clearing histamine from the body and being able to go back to a normal life and lifestyle. As always, any questions, drop them below the video and I will reply as soon as I can. I really hope that's been helpful and provides you with a little bit of a roadmap in regards to what you need to think about, what you could try if you're dealing with some of the symptoms that we listed.